Good morning. Can't believe we're all here.
Morning.
Morning. Good morning. Good morning.
I think we're still flashing. I know this is part of it. I put in the morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
It wasn't good. I think some of you
Well, to all of us. Okay. Let's get our bearings where we are today. So we were learning the halacha about asmachta, and we were in the likutim. Say she's chayav v'chachmama. Okay, kasavataz. Shtar chov is that? I think that's what we were up to. Shtar chov shekasuf bo shimlo yifra halo v'lizman ploni hu mischayv l'shalom malva kol ha'efsed shiv l'malva machmazeh v'gam ha'hotzaos. Let's say you have a promissory note, right? It's a guy has a debt. He owes $1,000, and he lets the creditor know in this piece of paper that if I don't pay you back by March the 1st, I will not only be obligated to pay you back the $1,000, but I will also pay you back all the loss that you will incur, including expenses for not having been paid back on that date. So here's the machlokus in the poskim. A guy says, now this could be, let's say, $10,000, $100,000, $1 million. I lend it to my friend, and I say, but I need it back by the 1st of the month, because by the 1st of the month, I have an investment opportunity. The guy writes, promise you, without fail, I will get you back the money by the 1st of the month, no matter what. And the guy says, how do I know that what kind of assurance? He says, not only will I guarantee to pay it back to you, but if you incur a loss because you don't have that money, I'll assume that loss. So because he couldn't do the investment when he needed the money at the 1st of the month, he's lost out on a tremendous opportunity. He wants the guy to pay him back. Is that considered an asmachta or not? Is that considered to be some kind of exaggerative assurance that he didn't mean seriously? Or can you hold him to his word? Machlokas haposkim. And whenever you get a machlokas haposkim with dine mominis, so what that invariably means is that you can't make him pay, because he'll always side with those poskim who say that he doesn't have to pay. Okay. What's that? Well, so that's an interesting question. It's only going to be ribis if technically if it's a percentage of the loan, and there's potential accrual of further payment. But if it's a one-time penalty, you are allowed to impose that. Like it's not considered ribis. Like for example, many times a landlord will build into the rent that the rent is due by the 1st of the month, and if you don't pay by the 1st of the month, there's a 15% service charge. That's not ribis. That's not ribis. As long as it's done on a one-time basis, you can't say, and if you don't pay by the 15th, you have to pay another 15%. No, it can only be one. Okay. Well, the Beit-Din would basically, it would be brought to their attention that there's a machlokus in the poskim, and generally the rule is hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, that whoever wishes to extract money from the other has to bring solid, incontrovertible evidence that they are entitled to the money. If the defendant can point to those other poskim who say that he's not liable, so the Beis Din can't obligate him to pay. Unless the Beis Din is so convinced that that other opinion is incorrect, which is unlikely, especially if it's an already established machlokas. Okay? You're right, there is no point in going to Beis Din. Yeah. Yeah. In other words, if someone came to me with this kind of situation, I would say to them, here, look, you're not going to be able to prevail in Beis Din. He's going to pull out you're going to pull out the Beis Yosef in the Torah. He's going to pull out the Sma and the Shach. What's the point? He's just going to show the Beis Din that he has a side to take, and you're not going to be able to extract his money. Just be happy that you get your money back. The original principle. No. No, not
So like time on our own, we have to use that.
Yeah.
Why do we stop that?
Why? Just because the age of a posek is not a criterion. If anything, the later poskim should have the final word. So that was a rule that Chazal themselves instituted just for that era, the era of the Tanakh. Right.
We're saying
Correct. Correct. A lot of times Rav Moshe Feinstein argued with the Chassam Sofer, came a century before him, at least over a century before him. He would disagree with other Achronim who lived 2-3 centuries before him. And you're allowed to do that. Rav Asher Weiss talks about it all the time. Yeah. Okay. So just getting back now to the Imrei Yaakov. So let's take a look now. Let's go a little bit further at the Imrei Yaakov. So we learned about what an asmachta is. It's sometimes an exaggerative statement that's not meant to be made, not to be taken literally. So shosomechas daito shelo yiskayim hatanai. So he says over here that what we're essentially saying in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, the chol shtar sheyesh bo kinyan, any shtar that has a kinyan recorded in it, bein shtar chov, bein shtar mechira o matana, v'yesh bo tanai v'asmachta. So whether it's a promissory note or whether it's a transactional note, like an invoice on a sale, if it contains a tanai and an asmachta that is written in such a way, shesomeches daito shelo yiskayim hatanai, v'lo haya hakinyan klum, v'nimsa shelo gomar v'hikna. He says that basically the person making the commitment, right, is not being serious about, even though a kinyan was made, but since, in other words, I promise you I'm going to sell you something if you do such and such for me, and such was never meant to be taken seriously. Right. So therefore, even though a kinyan was made, he says, and therefore the kinyan was never meant to be taken seriously. And therefore, even if the guy, the purchaser fulfills the tanai, the kinyan is not effective unless the kinyan was made in front of a Beis Din chashuv, sha'az gomar v'hikna, because then we know that the the transaction was meant seriously, because they wouldn't have assembled a based in chashuv or recorded in the shtar that it was of a based in chashuv unless they meant to be taken seriously. So the person who's committing to make the transaction, but includes the asmachta is so outlandish that he doesn't take it seriously. So the Imrei Yaakov says, "Kagon mishapora mixas chovo v'hishli shtaro." Here's an example of an outlandish conditional statement where a debtor, pays back a portion of a debt. There's a debt for $100,000, let's say, and the guy pays back 20,000. Well, he's got to ask the creditor for some kind of acknowledgement for the payment of the debt, of the partial payment of the debt. So he basically tells the creditor, give the promissory note to a third party. Va'amar lo, im lo eten lecha ad yom ploni, tein lo shtaro. And he says to the creditor, if I don't pay you back the balance, the 80,000 that I still owe you by the first of the month, then the third party can give you back the full promissory note. Okay? In other words, and then the debt will go back to 100,000. V'higia hasman v'lo nasan lo yitein hashlisha sashtar l'malva. He says, in that kind of scenario, the third party, the escrow person, should not give the promissory note back to the malva, even though the lova promised, even though the debtor promised, if I don't pay the balance back by the first of the month, you can collect on the entire amount, right? He doesn't mean it seriously. Shazu asmachti, the samcha daite shlo yiskayim hatanai v'lo yachol hashibud. Because there you have to assume that the debtor never truly believed that it would come to that it would come to a point where he wouldn't be able to get the balance by the first of the month. And therefore, he's not stam giving a gift to the malva. Oh, im hilveyu al sadeu v'hisna. Or here's another example. Ruvain lends money to Shimon and asks Shimon for collateral. Shimon says, okay, my field is my collateral. It's a patch of real estate. Shimlo yifrlo ad gimel shanim yiyeh shel malva. And he promises him, if I don't pay you back within 3 years, then the field will belong to you. Dahava asmachta, dahalov samach shelo yiskayim hatanai v'yachol achzir lo chovo bizman. He says that in that kind of situation, the malva doesn't seriously believe that he's going to have to forfeit the piece of real estate. Now, in the footnote, he points out, he says there's a machlokes here. When do we say that it's not meant seriously? Is it only when the field is worth more than the debt? But is that the reason why it's not meant to be taken seriously? He says, so that seems to be at least one of the opinions as to why it's not meant to be taken seriously.
That's common practice today. You get natural to your property.
Right. Even though the property is worth more, the understanding is that you'll sell it off and you'll pull out the equity that is owed to you. Yeah. Right. So I'm not sure why. So again, it would have to be the contract would have to be drawn up in such a way where it's made clear that it is not meant as an asmachta, but that it's meant seriously. I suppose that's the issue here, is that if there's any way to interpret it as not being meant to be taken seriously, then you have to seal all of those holes. He says, Ach be'emes matzinu, degam b'makom shelo shayach lomar shesomech shelo yiskayim hatanai, mikol makom havi asmachta, u'chemoshe kosafti le'el sifkat n'samach beis, divrei masel be'asmachta b'shem harambam ayin sham, dehol v'lo omer b'loshon al menas, He says, the truth is there are other kinds of conditions that are placed in documents that even if there's no reason not to take them seriously, but if they're malformed conditions, then they also don't have legal standing. He says, because since you didn't write it in the language of almanas on the condition, o belashon harehi mechura lecha, that it becomes yours, havi asmachta. De'einze mechira ma'al yasa de logomer belibo lahaknosa. He says, because anytime language is not formed correctly, then the person who's relinquishing the property does not mean it seriously. And therefore, you have to make sure, which is unfortunate. I mean, I'm not sure I really understand that. If it's clear from the context that this was the understanding, I don't know why a person can rely on a technicality and say, you didn't use the right language, so I don't have to pay you. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah. So anything that does become common practice, you can't pull the asmachta card, right? Because once it becomes standard business practice, then it becomes standard business practice. Okay, so I'm not really sure how Beis Din's going to deal with this halacha, but clearly, if you want to be able to ensure that no one can pull that shtick in Beis Din, you have to make sure that the shtar is drawn up probably by a lawyer, so that it's clear that at least according to secular law, no one can pull any shtick. Kasav harama, the davar sheyesh biyado lasos v'lo gazim, that if a person can fulfill a condition, and he's not exaggerating, kagon shamar im over v'lo evod ashalem b'meitav lo havi asmachta v'kanya. He says, if I think that im over means if I'm able to appear to cross over, and I don't end up working for you, then I will pay you the meitav. I'll pay you the finest quality of my real estate. So then, in those situations, it's not an asmachta, because the person is saying something that's realistic. Aval igazim ka'amar imlo evod ashalim alfa zuze. But if a person says, if I don't work for you, then I'll pay you 1,000 zuz, havi asmachta v'lo kanya. In other words, it has to be exaggerative, where I promise to pay you much more than it would be worth it for me to pay you. That's what the Ramah writes. So part of the reason why it's called an asmachta is because the person is promising more than what most people would consider to be an appropriate amount of quid pro quo. Okay, let us go further. Based in chashuv, right? It has to be in front of a chashuv Beis Din. So what's the definition of a chashuv Beis Din? So he says, "V'chol shlosha debiki b'dini asmachta mikri Beis Din chashuv le'inyan zeh." Any three people who are familiar with the laws of asmachta, I guess that includes you now in this room, would be qualified to sit on a Beis Din like this. V'yesh omrim deboinan Beis Din chashuv shebeir o hamumcha l'rabim. Some, however, argue, and they say that it has to be a Beis Din that is well known to the city, that these are the chashuv rabbanim of the city, right? And only then, or someone who's already known as a public mumcha, as a public expert in Hilchos Choshen Mishpat. Okay. Next, he says you could even if you don't do it in front of a Beis Din chashuv, make the kinyan, as long as you record in the shtar that it was done in front of a Beis Din chashuv, then that's good enough, even though it's not true. And Shuhusheka, the Imrei Yaakov writes, "Va'af she'ein sham Beis Din klal," even though there isn't any Beis Din present at all. That's really what we're saying. Right. It apparently not, and I think the reason is because this becomes standard format. It becomes a standard way of substantiating that we don't mean it to be an asmachta, and therefore everyone understands that when you put that in, it's not so much that you're lying, but rather utilizing a text that will make the contract bulletproof. I think that's the issue. Okay, we're going to continue on to the next. Okay. Hodoas baldin kimeya edim shegamar vehikna. He says, nonetheless, once the person who's indebting himself says that this is, I am binding myself to this based on it being in front of a based in chashuv, then that's an admission that he owes the money. Another thing that you can do to make this shtar taken seriously is if you write in the shtar, I accept upon myself with a cherem or a shavua, that if I don't fulfill it, I should be put under a ban, or that it is tantamount to violating a shavua, an oath. Shehein mo'ilos afilu ba'asmachta, that all of those languages are effective to go to make sure that it is not meant as an asmachta. Kishemetzava lichtov came when he tells the guy that he wants it to be written in that way. Gomar vehikna afal pi shelo kibul alav. He means the shtar to be taken seriously, even if he doesn't literally accept upon himself a cherem or a shvua. Utzrichim ha'idem li zahir b'chol zeh shelo. And we're not going to go through all of the long biurim here. He says you have to be very careful, the witnesses, with all of this. Shelo lichtov kein b'shtar ad sheyitzaveh lahem. Don't write this in the shtar until the debtor tells you to put that text in. You can't just put it in with the assumption that this is standard practice, and therefore we'll assume that he wants it to be put in the shtar. No, that's not up to the Eidim to make that determination. They're supposed to be objective observers, not to aid and abet the malva to make sure that he's able to collect this the outlandish guarantee. Okay, so the Imrei Yaakov says the kaven shetziva lichtov shekibul of b'chomer hazeh harei anu roim shegamar v'hikna. Once the debtor says, I want you to record that text in the shtar that I accept upon myself with a cherem or a shvua, you see that he's serious about it. You see that he really means to pay that added amount, even though it's not considered to be normative, but he wants it to be taken seriously. But like we said, you have to wait until the debtor tells you to write it explicitly. Aval imlo Istam kinyan va'afilim aminugu b'medina lichtov came b'chol shtari kinyan. He says, but you can't write it if the debtor did not authorize you to write it, even though he made a kinyan. But we said that's not enough to make an asmachta binding. Even if that's the standard practice to write that the debtor hereby accepts upon himself with a konim, or with a cherem or a shavua. He says you can't write that until the guy tells you to write it. Aval kishomer lahem kisvu utnu lo shtar, afal pishalo omer lahem beferish lichtov kol lashonos hamo'ilim ba'asmachta, arei elu yichtavu kol halashonos shenagu lekosvam bishtar kol hasharas kazeh ba'oso ha'ir. He says, however, if the debtor says to the witnesses, in other words, up until now, we're talking about a case where the witnesses see the guy make a kinyan, so the kinyan automatically triggers an assumption that he wants a shtar. Okay, but since he didn't explicitly say write a shtar to guarantee this guy, the creditor, what I owe him, you can't just put in all of that text. But once the debtor says write a binding shtar and give it to the malva, even though he may not be well versed in all of the things that make an asmachta binding, the witnesses should write in the standard text that make it binding. He says, because that once that becomes the convention, the standard in that city, so then you have to include it to make sure the document will be bulletproof. Bein shehein lashonos hamo'ilim basmachta, bein hamo'ilim lene'emanus sheyehi amal v'neman below shavua. He says, and this is true whether the language that is used in the shtar that has become the standard, like we have in a ketubah, we say deloka asmachta deloka tofse deshtari at the end of the the end of the ketubah. We say we don't want this to be taken as an asmachta. We don't want it to just be like standard text, the gobbledygook at the in a star. Everything that is written in this ketubah is binding, and a ketubah is a promissory note. That's really all a ketubah is. So therefore, once the witnesses know that the debtor wishes to have a paper that records this transaction, they should use whatever language is the standard text in their city. And he writes, Bein shehein lashonos hamo'ilim ba'asmachta, whether they are languages to help enforce the asmachta and make sure that no one can claim asmachta, Bein hamo'ilim l'ne'emanus, she'e'amal v'ne'eman below shvua. Sometimes additional language is included so that when the malva has that paper with that language, he is allowed to collect without having to take an oath in Beis Din. Because there are situations where, let's say, the lova claims that this is a forgery. Let's say the lova claims that this paper is a forgery, or that he accuses the malva of certain things like, I've already paid you back. So there are times when the Beis Din will be able to impose a shavua on the malva before he can collect. But let's say the malva doesn't want to have to take a shavua. He doesn't want to have to deal with the hassle. So he can have included in the shtar certain language that says the bearer of this promissory note is so authorized with this paper that he will not have to swear in the event that he wishes to collect. Right? So that would be another reason that he would want additional text put in. And it could be that the place where you live has already incorporated that kind of language in the standard text of a promissory note. So v'kibla b'cherim shelo nifra mechovo bein bittul moda'a b'shtar mechira bein kasvua b'shuka b'shtar matana shelo tehei matana misuteres she'ena klum. Right, so the Rav Shulchan Aruch over here is just giving different kinds of languages that you would want to put into the shtar, where the promissory note says that the creditor accepts upon himself a cherem that he will not use this note to collect the debt more than once. Okay. Bein bittul moda'a b'shtar mechira, or let's say there is a disclaimer that is put in the shtar that when a person sells an item, he forfeits any rights to claim later on that he didn't sell the item. Bein kasvua b'shuka b'shtar matana shelo tehei matana misuteres, or he puts a clause in the contract to make sure that if this piece of paper is to mark a gift, that the paper says that there can be no going back on the gift. However you want to write it, that the person cannot renege on the gift. V'chein sha'ar kol yifei koach shenagu lichtov bein b'shtar chov bein b'shar shtaros, and all other kinds of texts that are put in contracts to enforce the power of the holder of the paper. V'hu shehaminag pashat b'chol shtaros sheba'os ha'ir lichtov kain, provided that becomes the standard custom of that locality, to write that in the standard shtar. So, and therefore, b'zeh shemitzav le'idim stam lichtov shtar, Yodea shenagu kain. And therefore, going back to our case, why did the debtor just say write up a shtar? Right? Because he knows that there is a standard text. He doesn't have to tell you exactly what that standard text is. There's already a standard format for making the paper bulletproof. And he wants all of that thrown in. That's implicit in his statement when he tells the witnesses, I hereby give you permission to write up a piece of paper that records our transaction and the conditions placed on the transaction. And if his intention was for them to water down the shtar and not include all of the additional text, he should have told them explicitly, please do not include all of the standard text of our town that makes the paper bulletproof. Below Piresh Lahem, hu hifsid la'atzma. And if he doesn't say that to the witnesses, then it's his own fault. It's his own loss. Because once a text becomes standard practice, it becomes the convention of a locality, then it's assumed to be what is the intention whenever a person says, write up a star.
They say that they don't want this to be there. Can you think that they have a double expectation that they don't want to pay, literally? Because if they don't want all the
It could be that his objection, and we'll hold it here for today.